Hello, friends. Today we will be talking about Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. This book has been on my to-read list for almost a year, and now that I've read it, it did not disappoint. I laughed, I cried, I craved tteokbokki, I bought tteokbokki, I took the book with me to the gym, and then I cried at the gym. Such is life. Because this book is such a beautiful tribute to cooking and food, I decided to pair it with a cooking session on The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. The drink of the day is water with ice because we could all use some good hydration. So, grab your cozy drink and let's get into it. Crying in H Mart was released exactly 1 year ago. Michelle Zauner writes a memoir that gives us insight for what it means to be the daughter of immigrant parents. The first line of her book is, "Ever since my mom died, I cry in H Mart." Michelle is half Korean, half American, but a big part of her life is shaped by her Korean mother and their love of food. She explains that an H Mart is an Asian storefront that has all the necessities for authentic Asian cuisine. Her and her mother would often go together. On this specific trip, she asks herself, "I wonder how many people at H Mart miss their families. How many are thinking of them as they bring their trays back from different stalls? If they're eating to feel connected, to celebrate these people through food. Which ones weren't able to fly back home this year? Or even the past 10 years? Which ones are like me, missing the people who are gone from their lives forever?" We are searching for a piece of home, or a piece of ourselves. We look for a taste of it in the food we order and the ingredients we buy. Then we separate. We bring the haul back to our dorm rooms or our suburban kitchens, and we recreate the dish that couldn't be made without our journey. Michelle explains that her mother dies at 56 when she was 25 years old due to stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Michelle doesn't necessarily share her story in a linear format, but for the sake of this video, I will be sharing it chronologically. From a young age, Michelle realizes that she wants to please her mother, but she also recognizes that she has a desire to push the boundaries of rules. Caught between these two choices, she sees that the one way she can please her mother is by being brave and trying out new foods. She would try dishes like sea cucumber, tartare, snails, cuttlefish, any food that children would normally squeam at if they were her age. Her childhood was also full of memories visiting Korea every other summer, where she'd visit her aunties, cousin, and grandmother. Even as a child, she was beginning to realize that she existed in a sort of void. She wasn't Korean enough, but she also wasn't white enough back home in Eugene, Oregon. Her grandmother passed away when she was 14. When her mom came back home from the funeral, Michelle describes how her mother let out a distinctly Korean wail. It was also during this time that Michelle started to struggle with depression. The only way her mother knew how to help was by fixating on her every move, depriving her of privacy, forcing her to join extracurriculars, and fussing over her weight. The only respite Michelle found during this time was with her love of music. She'd spend hours downloading music off of LimeWire and eventually decided to learn how to play the guitar, much to the chagrin of her mother. The mother-daughter fights continued. Michelle was about to turn 18 and she was planning on moving to the East Coast. Her mom mentions, "On the East Coast, everyone's gonna think you're a homeless person." Michelle tells her, "Well, I'm not like you. I have more important things to think about than the way I look." Her mom grabs her hand and is ready to hit the backside of her palm when her dad hears the commotion. Her mom tackles her down and yells at her, "Why are you doing this to us? After everything we have given you, how can you treat us this way?" It's during this fight that her mother confesses that she had an abortion because she couldn't handle her as a child. Flashing forward to her adult age, Michelle is traveling back from Pennsylvania to Oregon in order to care for her mother. Knowing that her mother is sick, she sees this as a way to make amends for all the times she was a terrible daughter. In Pennsylvania, she has been writing music and playing with her small band. She was supposed to go on tour, but instead cancels in order to be with her mom. Although she's super nervous that her mom will be critical of her when she arrives back in Oregon, her mom greets her with a bountiful feast. Radish kimchi, short ribs, hard-boiled soy sauce eggs, and so much more foods. To Michelle, it was quickly apparent that her mom was not doing well. She wasn't eating and staying mostly in her room. Michelle would make special trips to the H Mart and to the Korean restaurant in town to find foods that her mother enjoyed, but she still wouldn't eat. By the 6th day, her mother was looking bad off enough that they took her to the hospital. After a long day there, she came home to her dad. He was sitting at the table eating marijuana gummies and drinking. He asks her, "You have to promise me you're going to be there for me. Promise me, okay?" This promise was especially difficult for Michelle, as she was very aware of her father's alcoholism, some bouts of unfaithfulness to his wife, and even now, instead of being a parent and comforting Michelle, he wanted to be the one who was comforted. When her mother is released 2 weeks later, some friends come by and help to take care of her. One such person was Kai, a stern older woman who, while being very devoted to the care of her mother, was also very cold towards Michelle and her father. She was not only protective of Changmi's food, but her time and space as well. For Michelle, Kai reinforced the feelings of being stuck in this void. She wasn't Korean enough for Kai's acceptance, but still not white enough. Changmi had seen how badly cancer had gone for her sister and refused to go through more than 2 rounds of chemotherapy. When the doctors let them know that the cancer hadn't shrunk at all, Changmi made the decision to visit Korea to say goodbye to her country and her family. While she's there, she gets terribly ill. The moment she's somewhat better, they emergency transport her back to Eugene. It's during this trip that Michelle decides that she has to marry her longtime boyfriend Peter. He agrees and they immediately start making plans for the wedding. In a way, Michelle believes that if her mother has a reason to keep going, she can keep her alive. They work together to make all the plans, choose out a dress, pick decorations, and try out cakes. It was a time that gave them hope. They held the wedding in the parents' backyard. Not long after the wedding was over, Changmi continued to deteriorate, sleeping more and still not eating. Hospice brought over a bed, but Michelle couldn't bring herself to move her there. The two would spend time in bed together, watching television, holding on to each other. On Changmi's final days, she was mostly in a sleeping state. In one of her most heart-wrenching moments, Michelle shares how Changmi's last words were the Korean words for pain. Michelle felt incredibly betrayed by the doctors who had promised she would not have to die in pain. Her father and her watched over her, knowing she was there and yet not. One night, Michelle's father wakes her up. "She's gone," he says. Michelle begins the process of changing her mother out of her pajamas and into more presentable clothing. Alone in that room with her mother, Michelle understands the pain she saw her own mother go through. She describes feeling haunted by the view of 3 men removing her mother on a gurney, zipped in a black bag. The funeral was simple and it was religious, something Michelle didn't expect to happen because her family really wasn't religious at all. Trying to find a way to cope through it all, Michelle's dad pays for them to visit Vietnam. There's this lingering unanswered question of how the two of them will stay united, especially now that the person that brought them together is gone. Their own unspoken issues erupt when her father is impolite to an attendant and asks that Michelle's dish be taken back. The two cause a scene and Michelle ultimately walks back to her hotel. They spend the rest of the trip pretending like it didn't really happen. When they get back to the United States, her father gets into a car accident, clearly having been drinking and driving. Months later, her father had been spending some time in Thailand and eventually wants to move there. Michelle keeps herself busy working at a restaurant and eventually her and Peter move to Brooklyn, New York. The songs she recorded start taking off and she's offered the ability to tour Korea. The book ends as Michelle is spending time with her aunt, singing karaoke. She writes, "I chased after Korean characters that seemed highlighted at the breakneck speed of pinball. I let the lyrics fly from my mouth, always just a little bit behind, hoping my mother tongue would guide me." I loved so many things about this book, but maybe most strongly was the way I felt seen. Michelle recognizes that the relationship between her and her mother was wrought. They both did and said things that were deeply hurtful. Michelle's actions never stopped Changmi from loving her. Changmi's inability to empathize and understand Michelle never stopped Michelle from loving and appreciating all the things her mother did for her. And I empathized with this kind of relationship. Navigating family relationships is challenging. While there are situations where family members can be downright toxic, there's also this space that Michelle is writing about. There are broken people who don't know exactly how to love one another, but at the end of the day, the love is very much there, and they are able to show it in different ways. While Michelle was stuck feeling the regret for her actions and the hurt of her mother's critical words, she also craved them, their love of food, the way that they uniquely bonded. It was somewhat harder to see this bond between Michelle and her father. Not only was he not the focus, but there was a palpable disconnect in their relationship. As I mentioned during the summary, another strongly present notion is how Michelle grapples with her identity as half Korean, half American. Because her biggest connection to Korean culture was food, this is how she reconciles her identity. For many of us second-generation immigrants, it is so hard to find this identity. We can't necessarily go to our relatives to understand our cultures. And doing research doesn't necessarily mean that that's what our parents went through. We do our best to find connections, but we're never 100% connected. Reading through the chapters focusing specifically on Changmi's decline before she died was really tough. We know she passes away from the beginning of the book, but the way that Michelle describes this time is what really speaks to her goal of sharing this story as a tribute to her mom. That being said, while I acknowledge that this is definitely a wrong read for someone going through a similar kind of grief, there's also a sort of peace that comes from reading a shared experience. Overall, I highly recommend this book. I am a sucker for memoirs and life stories, but Michelle really does accomplish something beautiful here. Her words give readers an appreciation for Korean culture and food, And the mix of rhetoric and narrative makes this a read you want to work through in one sitting. It's the kind of book that leaves you thinking for days after you've finished it. If you've read Crying in H Mart, I definitely want to hear your thoughts and opinions. Let me know what you think down below. I hope you enjoyed a little bit of cooking, hunting, and all things Legend of Zelda on this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.